Catherine Gonzalez. In fact, I'm Catherine Gunsalus Gonzalez, which is even more confusing. And I taught church history at Columbia from January of 1974 until June of 2002. I was teaching at Louisville Presbyterian Seminary, and I'd been there for 3.5 years. And in December of '73, I married Justo Gonzalez, who was teaching at Emory. We were married 2 weeks before I began teaching here. We had to arrange it for exam week. It was March 21st of '73. It was the beginning of a new triennium of the Faith and Order Commission of the National Council of Churches. And I was representing the Presbyterians and he was representing the Methodists. And he was teaching at Candler at Emory and I was teaching at Louisville. But we met there and we were married in December. What I hope students took away from, especially that introductory church history class, was a love for history. To deal with almost any question at the present, you have to know the history behind how it got to this point. You have to know what are the pitfalls that occurred that people are trying to avoid. So I think that the knowledge of history is absolutely essential for dealing with most anything, either in theology or the church. Well, I was the first and only woman teaching at Louisville. So I'd had 3.5 years of being the first and only. And then I came here, and I was the first and only for 10 years. So that's a total of 13 years. There was one woman at Princeton, she went there the same time I went to Louisville. But there just weren't any others. I don't think there were any at Candler during that time. Until you began to have more women ordained. So it depended on the churches agreeing to the ordination of women. The Southern Church didn't ordain women until '64. So by the time I got here, there were very few women ordained. And there were very few women who had ever seen a woman preaching. There were no models. Being in the pulpit was just not something they could, it was what I called an unthinkable thought. There were no models for it, and so it really took a good 15 or 20 years before you had enough women actually thinking about being ordained. There weren't women in the PhD programs to be ready to teach in seminary. I was the only one when I went through in theology. And you had to have that group of women who went to seminary with a sense of vocation and who then went into graduate school with a sense of vocation. And that's going to take 20, 25 years to get them through that pipeline. I had gone to seminary, and I went to a Methodist seminary, I went to Boston University, because they had a program for campus ministry. I was planning to do campus ministry, but I realized I'd be miserable that close to a campus and not able to teach, which is why I stayed on for the PhD. But then the only jobs were college teaching, which I did, combined with campus ministry. And then I was inadvertently interviewed for a job at Louisville. I didn't know there was a job, and I didn't know I was being interviewed. But that was such a break in the way things happened. I think had they advertised the job, it would have been just one of those things that wasn't possible. Now, coming here, it would have been unlikely coming here. This was probably the most conservative seminary of the Southern Church. And it was all the pressure of a group breaking away from the church because of the ordination of women. But the day before I met Justo, I met Ben Klein. He wanted to meet me because I was teaching a course on the church and women. And he knew I was going to be on sabbatical. He wanted me to come to Columbia to teach that course because he had a group of very angry women, students who were banging pots and pans in classes whenever the term men was used. And he had an all-male faculty, and he wanted me just to come to teach that course, to be with the women students here. When it was clear we wanted to get married, he came and saw Ben Klein and told him. But there wasn't any job. And so I was hired by the General Assembly for a job at the center dealing with theological education and the continuing education of pastors, to begin just after we got married in December. And I would be in Atlanta. But the day after I was offered that job, the person teaching church history here resigned. And at that point, Ben called the person who just hired me, who said I could renegotiate. And at that point, he called and asked if I would be interviewed to come to teach here in my field. It was not a usual process. And I think had that not happened, again, I don't think there would have been an opening. A sizable part of the board did not agree to my coming. And you usually would take that as a sign you shouldn't do it. But Ben said, don't worry about it at all. And I came in January, and in April, the PCA was formed. And all the people who hadn't voted for me were no longer on the board because they no longer were in the same church. The beginning here, I was welcomed by the faculty. The faculty was great. There were many students who were very upset because I had them first year, 5 hours a week in church history, and they were totally opposed to having a woman. I mean, there was a sizable group of students who were very positive, but that small group, I mean, you'd come in and there was one who would have a tape recorder who was trying to find out if I was saying anything heretical that he could take back to his presbytery. But that was just through the first year or two, because once the split occurred, those students weren't here. I think precisely because of that, the ones who were here were extremely supportive. Beverly Gavinta was here. She came in New Testament. Well, the very first was Lucy Rose. The very first was Lucy Rose. That was the 10 years. And Lucy came, and that was great. And she was in homiletics. And of all the fields in the practical area that would be difficult for a woman to come into was homiletics. But it was also clear that if you're going to have women preaching, you had to have someone in that field. Beverly came, and I think she was here about 5 or 6 years before she went to Princeton. I remember one meeting in the faculty where Sarah Youngst was here in continuing education. And Beverly and Lucy and me, and I think there was someone else. It was probably Ann Clay. And in this faculty meeting, they decided that they were going to divide into small groups to discuss issues. And we looked around. And so we formed a group, and we decided, we talked about the issues. Well, when we came back to report, first of all, when we came back to report, it was the first time that the rest of the faculty realized that there had been no women on any of their group. And secondly, what we reported was very different than what they did. So it was just a very interesting learning when we had enough to caucus. I was teaching this course on the church and women. I think every woman who was a student came into that course because it was sort of, this is the other side of the story. If you had a feminist perspective on New Testament or on Old Testament or on pastoral care or on preaching or on anything else, this is what's sort of missing in the rest. It changed enormously, first of all, when you began to have women in those fields. I didn't have to do any of that. And furthermore, the young men who began coming through had been taught by women. So that the fields just changed. There was no need for me to have that course anymore. And that was probably by the early 90s, by 90. It was a different ballgame completely. to see the changes, to see the changes in the number of women, that just, it happened so quickly. Really, maybe only if you teach history do you think it's quick, but it really, from 1970, when I went to Louisville, to 1990 is only 20 years. Martha Moore-Kish in theology. Just the number of people teaching in classical fields is absolutely enormous. What's interesting is that there were probably more married women than single. The young women who were just married men who knew that their wives wanted to go to seminary and be ministers. The older women generally were married to pastors whom they had met in seminary when they went in Christian education and happily married a pastor, only to realize when the whole issue of the ordination of women came up that they really had wanted to be pastors. But they were married to men who didn't want a wife who was a minister. So the other characteristic I think you had, especially of the young women, is that they were very bright. They were top students. And once they came to seminary, they got so many of the prizes. They were top students in Greek and Hebrew. They were top students in theology. They had strong sense of vocation, a very strong sense of vocation. They had probably been in a church with a woman associate. They had seen women preaching, and they thought, that's exactly what I want to do. There were several seniors in that course. There were always a few men in the course, but there were several women seniors in that course. They were very, very good students, very good preachers. And in the conversations in class, we realized they were being interviewed sequentially by exactly the same churches, big steeple churches, maybe 4 of them around the country. And they were just trailing each other, going around being interviewed by these churches, and always as an associate. We'd had word from a few of the women who had gone through that before that there was a serious problem, that the women who became associates in those churches very often discovered that they were there to show to the world that this was a liberal church, but they were not to rock the boat. And they began to say, I don't think I want to take a job as an associate in that kind of circumstance. I think I'd rather try a solo pastorate in a small church where I can change things. But it was an interesting period of time. I would say it was the early 80s where all of these bright young women were getting jobs in the church, and the church was not yet ready to change. Well, it produced some very good pastors. That's very clear. Also produced a moderator. That's with John Gray. The women were excited to be able to be pastors. I think that's what was clear. When it is so difficult to do, you need a strong sense of vocation to do it. And that was clear. I think that was clear for the first wave of women going through seminary, and it was true for the first wave of women who began to teach in seminary. You have to have a strong sense of vocation, or you'd never do it. The issue of women in seminary broke so quickly. It was much easier once a seminary opened to the possibility of women, it was Presbyterian women here. It could be Lutheran women at Lutheran seminary. But we grew up in the same churches as the men. We grew up in the same households as the men. It was not a different culture. We were training here to train pastors who were going into the same churches we knew. And so once women began to enter, it just broke so quickly that you knew the battle in terms of teaching in seminary, unless you were at a Southern seminary where it split the church, a Southern Baptist seminary where it split the church, and you were one or the other, the battle was over. That on any faculty position, the possibility of a woman being hired was as great as a man being hired. There was no more battle on that issue.